we've got another exciting episode today for you, and especially for some of you who have been commenting and being a part of the community, which is something that I wanted to mention because today we are on episode 10 releasing this week. And we've got plenty more coming down the pipeline, and we're really excited to show you. But we've already got suggestions for authors to come on. We've got questions that people have been asking, and I'm really excited to see that this show is really starting to build that community, which is what we're kind of trying to do here, connecting writers and authors together. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Alex Bledsoe onto the show. Thank you for coming.
Oh,
Is it
thanks for having
Bledsoe?
me.
Did I say it right?
Yes, you did.
Okay, good. I need to make sure that I pronounce better. So Alex is not only a suggestion from a friend of mine and a follower of the show, shout out to you, Darren, but also multi-published, and I'm talking tens of books. I'm talking more fingers than you can count, in multiple genres, and he is just excellent. So I'm going to read his bio here, and we'll just have you listen along. This is from his website, which was just too great for me not to read. Alex is the author of novels and stories about musical fairies from the Smoky Mountains living among us. A sword for hire who for 25 gold pieces a day will either find the skeletons or make sure they stay in the closet, and polyester-clad vampires in the 1970s who spent as much time dealing with the racial tensions as they do with bloodletting. That just was too perfect. Because I think that's anyone who likes fantasy, they're going to come right to that. So that's a little bit about Alex. And I kind of want to kick off with our typical question, and then we'll kind of jump into some of his expertise. But Alex, from both your experience as an author, as a writer, and being in the community with authors and writers around you, there seems to be something of a secret sauce to the successful author. And we'd just like to ask, are there any tendencies or traits that you've noticed recurring that makes a writer successful?
Well, the consistent thing that I've noticed, because everybody will tell you there are different secrets, but the
Mhm.
consistent tendency that I've seen is that all the good writers I know will write anywhere at any time. They don't need a special desk, they don't need a special coffee cup, they don't need anything like that. They need a flat surface for their laptop to go on and as much quiet as they can have. And that's it. And I'm the same way. When I was writing my first books, my children were very small and I was a stay-at-home parent. So I learned to write whenever their eyes closed. And
You have to.
and I mean, I would get up at like 4 in the morning to get a couple of hours in before they went to school and anytime. And I've seen that in other writers. I have a friend who will remain nameless, but he tells the story about how he was called on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving to say that a publisher that he worked with, they needed a first draft of a tie-in novel for I think it was a gaming tie-in novel. They needed a first draft of it by the Monday after Thanksgiving because somebody had dropped out. Now, what makes this so impressive is not only did he hit that deadline, but at the time he had toddler-aged quadruplets. So
Wow.
that's, that's what you have to have somewhere in you because you may never need to hit it that hard, but you have to have the reserves of determination to do it. And that's something consistent I've seen in every writer. That's good and that's successful is they can do it at any time. Excuse me. Of course,
That's great. No,
it's easier when you have a nice office and it's quiet and you can put some music on, and sit in your underwear and just get
have a Dr.
comfortable.
Pepper if you're me.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
gallons of iced tea if you're me. But you can't always get that, and you have to have the fortitude to push through the things that get in your way, because it's always easy to find an excuse not to write.
Mm, yeah. And in a previous episode, one of our guests mentioned that we get caught in sharpening our pencils. It's all about the leading up to it and the plotting around it, and you just gotta write it. You just
Yeah,
gotta have the time to just sit down and barf out the words and then fix them later. And
yeah,
I think that is a really scary step. So that's perfect advice. That could be part of our quote of the day, our plat quote, is to just
and kind of going along with that, there is, and I learned how prevalent this was by teaching classes for like teen writers and other writers, the fear of finishing is probably, once you've mastered the ability to make yourself write it, then you have the fear of finishing it, because once it's finished,
Mm,
it can be judged. And
that's
so
really,
a
yeah.
lot of people start writing and then they never finish, because as long as it's not finished, it's great.
Lives in your head. That's
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
but you have to overcome that. You have to finish it, even though it sucks. You can fix it, but you have to have it in front of
Mhm. Mhm. Well, and I think part of that, having the reserves to just keep working on it despite all of the craziness of life, I think that will help prepare you for when it's ready to be presented, when it's going to get judged, when you're going to have to keep making,
Yeah,
edits and stuff, because you've already been through the grueling process of trying to get it out there and get it done. I
yeah.
think there's a good connection there for sure. So thank you for that advice. I do want to get into um, he is a bit of an expert on fantasy and horror, and I want to talk about building your horror and fantasy with a realistic base, because a lot of people are like, fantasy, you can do whatever you want. That's not necessarily always true for writing.
No, it's not. And the best fantasy has a realistic base, because you're always, even if they're not biologically human, you're always telling stories about human beings. And when you look at the human beings around you, what do they have? They have jobs, they have families, they have responsibilities, they have hobbies, they have, you know, people they like, people they don't like, and all that stuff is important in your fantasy. In fact, it's more important in your fantasy, because if you can put that in there and make the characters seem real, your reader will accept any of the weird stuff you throw at them. And I've written sword and sorcery fantasy, and I've written um, kind of urban fantasy, although it takes place in the country, that's set in the modern world, and involves fantasy elements in that. And it's not that different. You're still creating people. You're still creating the world that they live in, and it's the world is important to the point that the characters interact with it. I know a lot of struggling fantasy writers that create these amazing fantasy worlds, and then they put cardboard people in them,
Hmm.
because they've spent so much of their intellectual capital, their imagination, creating the world, and they have nothing left. So they put, oh, we'll have a farm boy who's going to be the chosen one, and he'll have an older guy who's a mentor, and he'll have to save a princess. Yeah, we'll have him save a princess. And you realize you've read the story millions of times before.
Hmm.
So to from my approach, it's always about creating the people first, and then filling in the details of the world as they need it.
Hmm. So, what are your thoughts on? I mean, this has been drilled into my brain just from my education at college and beyond with writing. Um, Having to have, making your plot be important, but having your setting be kind of an active participant in the plot. Because if you strip down story down to the humanity of it, right, it's about just
Yeah.
people in the modern day. But you're setting it in fantasy, so that can be a little tricky. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, you want to integrate the setting with the characters. That's true of anything. If you're
Mhm.
writing a story about New York City, you want to integrate the characters living in New York City with how they respond to living there. And fantasy is no different. If anything, it's kind of easier, because you're not locked down to what's real. You can invent stuff and make it, you can make everybody have a talking, ferret as a pet. You can make that be the hot new thing that everybody's got. And how the different people interact with their talking ferrets tells you about the characters. So it's really, I don't want to say writing fantasy is no different than writing anything else, because there are differences, but ultimately what makes it grip a reader is the same thing. Your people, you know, throwing problems at them, having them have to deal with things. That's true across all genres. There's who is it? Jim Thompson, who's a mystery writer, said that there's really only one story. Things are not as they seem.
Mm,
And you know,
That's really good.
it's a little reductive, but in a lot of ways it's true.
Yeah, yeah. And I liked what you said about fantasy kind of being not a limitation, but more of a way that you can be creative with what we know
Oh
about
yeah,
humanity.
that's
You pair
why
them together.
that's why
Yeah.
people want to read it, and that's why I like writing it. That's why I'm sure most fantasy authors got into it, was because it's fun.
It's fun. It just is. Well, and
Yeah.
you also mentioned horror too, which I'm curious. I mean, fantasy and horror are, it is, I mean, both are rooted in humanity, but there is a lot of difference going on there with the emotions that you focus on. Do you
Right.
find it difficult to switch back and forth between those two genres?
No, not at all, because it's still, for me at least, it's still about the characters and what they're experiencing. Once you've got an idea, and in horror, it tends to be more of a singular idea. You've got a monster, or you've got, you know, an evil killer or something. You've got that one thing that's going to come in and mess everything up. Then you can focus on the emotions of the characters as they experience this.
Mm.
And you can have a lot of fun with that too, because, well, and like we talked about, horror and humor are real similar. And they, you know, they're both extreme emotions, and they both basically cause you to lose control.
And you quoted horror, humor and horror, two things that can make you pee your pants, which
Yes,
I thought was
exactly.
hilarious and very true. Yes.
So it's, you know, it's almost easier to write horror than it is to write fantasy. It's
Really.
really hard to write comedy. It's one thing to put a joke in a serious story, which I can do pretty well. But to set out to write comedy, I've only known a couple of people that were really good at that.
Mm.
That is hard to do.
Do you think it's because people have different senses of humor, or do you think it's just harder to pull just the modern world into it?
I think it's just because you have to have such a level of control to make a joke work.
Mm, yeah,
You you've got a lot more leeway with, you know, love or terror or, you know, anything like that. You don't have to necessarily make every word count to the degree that you do with a joke, but you tell a joke and you have 3 extra words in it and it ruins it.
that's true. I haven't thought about it that way. I've been more of a throw in a joke here and there, yeah, but I think keeping it as a whole base of humor would definitely be
Yeah.
a whole different ball game for sure.
Now, on the other end of that, I think giving characters humor, giving them senses of humor, is one of the greatest ways to get the reader to like them.
Mm,
Particularly if you're in an absurdist situation, like you are often in horror and fantasy. You know, the reader
mhm.
is more than likely going to think, "Oh, that's ridiculous." And if you have the character react, "That's ridiculous," then you've connected the two.
Mm,
Rather than trying to say, "Oh no, I'm being so serious here. You must not laugh at me." Just
yeah.
acknowledge it and, you know, make it part of the experience, and then you've got your reader on your side.
So make the reader or make the character act like the reader. There's the
To a,
quote. There's
to a
the
certain
flag.
to a certain extent. I mean, you know, we've all been in serious situations in our lives, and we all have that urge to make, you know, to make that snide remark to lighten the mood a little, just because it's too heavy to bear. And horror is like that. Horror is exactly like that. That's why so many of the best horror movies have great jokes in them. You know, you look at something like The Shining, or Dawn of the Dead, or The Reanimator, which is one of my favorites. Those movies are hysterical. They're also incredibly horrifying.
What contrasting binaries too. That's such a I mean, writers would can geek out about this, but getting those two just stark contrast and putting them together that seemingly wouldn't be so cohesive. I mean, I think that really does make for an interesting story for people, and then that's what they are attracted to.
Yeah,
See those different emotions.
I think that a lot of the early horror writers, like, you know, H.P. Lovecraft and Robert Bloch and people like that, they could because of their masterful command of language, they didn't have jokes in their stuff. I mean, whatever you say about Lovecraft, he's not funny. And Robert Bloch, not a funny guy. Who else would I'm thinking of now? Then you get into things like Richard Matheson, who begins to see how humor can work within horror. And by the time we get to the present day, most horror writers do put jokes in. Most horror writers have grown up reading the books and watching the movies where horror and humor go together. And I think I enjoy that. I mean, not to say I don't enjoy the old stuff too, because I do, but I find it more, unless you're going to have the command of language like some of these writers had, it's really hard to pull off.
Yeah.
And you look at somebody like Lovecraft, and he never told you what the final horror was. He just, he could get away with saying, and it was just too horrible to describe. Then, you wouldn't get that past an editor today.
No. I wouldn't think so anyway.
No.
It's gonna make me now from here on out, when I watch and read horror, I'm gonna be looking at it differently. I'm gonna be thinking about how they make the control that they have over the language and how they make those jokes work. So you've definitely opened my mind to some thoughts about these other genres, which is really interesting. So thank you. I also wanted to ask you, you are a fully traditionally published author,
Right.
which is definitely makes you a wizard in this industry right now, especially as all of the agents and publishers are going down in percentage because of COVID and things that have happened. And I just wanted to ask, for those who are in the process of they've done it, they've written it, they've edited it as much as they think they can, they think they might be ready. What's your advice to those who get the rejections, who feel like, is this even going to make it? Should I keep pursuing these rejections? Should I keep going through this pain that is writing sometimes?
Well, I started writing what became my first published novel when I was 18, and it came out when I was 44.
Wow.
So I stuck with it a long time. I got a lot of rejections. And I don't remember who said this, but somebody said, if you can quit writing, you probably should. If you can't, then you have to keep at it. And that's what I did. I submitted. When it came back, I submitted again. I took all the rejections and looked at them. If they had something useful in them, I took it. If it didn't sound like it was useful, I ignored it. And finally, I got an agent, and she sold my first book. And when that happened, there was still a big stigma on self-publishing that I don't think is there anymore. I think
It's changed a lot.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think you can self-publish with your head up.
Mm.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's tricks to it. You should pay for a good editor. You should pay for a good cover artist. Oh,
Mhm.
for God's sake, pay for a good cover artist. I don't know if you've
That's
ever
enough. Oh
looked
man,
at some of them. It's like, wow. And I don't think
loves it.
unless the author is also an artist and a trained one, I don't think they should do their own covers.
I don't know if you should anyway, just because you're too emotionally invested at that
Exactly.
point. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah. And given that, I don't know that I would have stuck with trying to get into traditional publishing to the same degree now if I was starting out. I would, if I wanted to be in traditional publishing, I would certainly give it a try. But if whatever arbitrary time I gave myself, 2 years, 5 years, if nothing happened, I would probably have gone into self-publishing by now.
Mm.
Because again, that's perfectly viable now.
Yeah. Yeah. So being in that time where you just feel like there is no other option, you got to keep moving forward
Yeah.
with these queries. Was there anything that you did to help remind yourself why you loved writing, to remind yourself that you had, a good story to tell, quality for the
No,
audience?
luckily, through all that, I was still writing other things.
Mm,
And I was getting short stories published back when there were magazines. So I was getting, just enough encouragement to keep me going. And again, it's one of those things that it's a I don't want to say drive, but I can't think of a better word. It's a drive that I have. I'm going to write no matter what. If I never sell another book, I'll still be writing stuff.
yeah,
I
and you're
have,
doing it for yourself. You're doing it because you
yes,
love it. Yeah,
yes,
and that should be what it is at the base of it all. It should, if you're doing it to get just to make money or just to try to get it published, that's going to be a way harder journey for you, and you won't enjoy it.
yeah.
Yeah.
If you're trying to grab onto whatever the latest trend is, by the time you finish writing the book, that trend will be over.
Well, and look at you as the example of that. I mean, you started at 18, but you just kept at it, and I mean, a lot of people wouldn't expect to have to wait that many years, but I think also a lot of experience comes with it. I know that I've had a lot of experience through the rejections,
Oh yeah,
definitely.
yeah.
That I look at my original draft or my original query and think, that could, that could definitely be better. And I'm glad that I've moved forward with it. So you do learn stuff from your failures. You do learn
Oh,
things from your failures
well, you
querying.
learn more from failing than you do from succeeding, because when you succeed, you think, okay, that's perfect because somebody else has justified this. And you have
Mm,
to eventually come to the realization that maybe it wasn't so perfect after all, because you've convinced yourself that it is. I know,
mm.
again, I keep thinking of these things that people have said, and I cannot remember who said them, but somebody said that no work of art is ever finished, it's only abandoned.
Mm,
And that's true. I look back
yep.
at my first book and I am embarrassed that, that's out there. But at the same time, it was the best I could do at the time with what I had to work with. And as long as I can say that, I can accept it. If,
Yep.
if I were telling that story again, it would be completely different. But that was the best I could do at the time.
But you would hope so. You would hope it would be different.
Well,
I'd hate to.
you hope that everything you do is better than the last thing you did.
Mm, yeah.
And and again, that's something I bring up when I'm teaching, is that you're not supposed to be satisfied with your own stuff.
Mm.
You aren't supposed to look at something you wrote a year ago and think, yeah, that's pretty perfect. You're supposed to just see the mistakes you make, because that means that you're getting better.
Ah, that I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that. I feel like I'm in the right industry then. 'Cause it never does feel finished. It never does. And I mean, I knew that that's what it's about, but it's always good to be reminded. So, with the publishing process that we've been talking about, with the querying, how much of this is some question kind of from audience, but in your opinion, how much of publishing and getting that agent and connecting is luck versus like who you know and timing?
Well, mine was luck. I didn't know anybody. I simply had a spreadsheet of agents that handled stuff like I was writing, and just went down it until I found one that, was interested.
Mhm.
So that my that was actually my third agent. My first agent was a music agent who'd wanted to get into books, but he didn't know anybody. So he was actually about as bad off as I was.
Mm.
My second agent, I signed with him, I sent him the manuscript, and I never heard a word for like a year. So I sent him a letter saying, I'm dropping you. And then my third agent was the one that actually represented me through pretty much everything that I've had published so far.
Mm.
And obviously,
That's a good story to know. So, technically, if you get to the point where there's a contactable agent, you still got to do your research and
oh yeah, oh
still
yeah.
follow through with that.
I
Yeah.
mean, every agent now, they have a website and they tell you exactly what they want. They want a synopsis, or they want the first three chapters, or
Mm.
and if you don't send them exactly what they're asking for, they're not going to look at any of it, because it automatically shows them you can't follow instructions and you're going to be hard to deal with.
It's not a good first impression, obviously.
No, I
Well,
mean,
for
it
you, it
doesn't.
really is just the grueling. I mean, and I think that does provide a lot of hope for the new listeners because a lot, I mean, I know a lot of people who they knew somebody or they, maybe won a Twitter contest
Yeah,
and that was their gateway in, which is great. But I think there are a lot of us that are still just in the trenches, throwing it to the slush pile and hoping that they get to it eventually. And
yeah.
yeah, and it
Well,
still works.
there's no wrong way to do it. I mean, if you know somebody, why wouldn't you take advantage of that? If you
Mm,
met somebody online, why wouldn't you say, would you be interested in reading this?
mm,
Because
yeah.
that's what all these connections are for. That's what these interwebs are designed to do, is put you in touch with people.
Yeah.
Now, my current novel that's coming out, gosh, in 3 weeks,
Oh,
it's a horror novel called Dandelion, and I met the publisher actually at that same Jordan Con that you were asking about earlier. And
oh yes.
that's been years and years ago. But I was able to email him and say, "Hey, do you remember me? We talked at this." And he did. And so I had my agent send him a copy of the manuscript, and he loved it, and that was that. So it's not bad to use contacts.
You never know when a contact will be helpful. Like you said, it was years later, right? So
Right.
how often do you make those contacts? Do you go to conferences? Do you do web contacting with people? How do you do it?
Well, I haven't been to a con since before COVID, obviously. And
Yeah.
honestly, I'm kind of, I don't know if I will be going to many cons because I don't what the stuff I write doesn't lend itself to con experiences really well. People don't dress up as my characters. They think about them and they write me long emails about them, which is fine. And I like to think I'm perfectly accessible online if anybody wants to talk to. So, I mean, I'm not saying I'll never go to a con, but I haven't got any planned in the future.
You don't have the need. And that does bring up another thing is you had a very niche specific publishing company that you went with.
Right.
And sometimes there's a little bit of like perceived voodoo around that it could be a problem or that you won't get out there as much. But your experience has been really positive. Could you share some about that?
Yeah. My first book, the hardcover, came out from a small press out in California. And then Tor bought the paperback and all the sequel rights. So everything else came out through Tor. And working with Tor was a great experience. I got to be like real life friends with my editor at the time and his assistant who took over when he moved on to something else. And that's great. It's great to feel that you're not just a professional cog, because I mean, writing is an art, publishing is a business. But at the same time, writers aren't there. Every writer is unique. Every writer you can't replace one writer with another one like you can in a lot of jobs. So it helps to feel like you've got a personal connection with the people you're dealing with.
Mhm.
Now, when this book came along, when I had the manuscript ready, it's too it's too horror-y, that's a word, for the mainstream presses that I'd worked with. So I looked around and I looked at who was publishing books like this, and I saw that Falstaff in North Carolina was doing some great stuff. And I'd actually read some of their stuff without any thoughts that I would be submitting. So I knew them. I knew what they put out. Like I said, I contacted John, the publisher, directly, and reminded him that we had met. Then I had my agent contact him, and it was just, I guess the only thing that's different is the scale. You work with a big publisher, and you'll have your cover art done, 6 months before the book comes out, because they've got a schedule. They've got like a book this week, a book this week, and anything that throws a cog into that messes up all the other books. A smaller press generally is more flexible. I
Which
mean,
could be what you're looking for. It just
yeah,
depends on, yeah.
and I mean, they did a thorough job editing. They gave me an absolutely great cover art.
Nice.
So I am really happy with that. But I'm not unhappy with the big press. So
Just the
I
pros and cons then, the
yeah, yeah,
differences between the two of them, because you do
and
get
knowing
more contact, but then also you get more personalized
and
contact on the
knowing
show.
what to expect. That's a
Yeah.
big thing, you know.
Okay.
If it's your first book, you know, ask them flat out, what's the production schedule? When should I expect to hear from the copy edit, from the cover artist, you know?
Mhm.
So that you know what's coming.
Yeah. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
That's great. You have given us a ton of wisdom already for this, and I am so excited to release this episode. And I'm glad that you were number 10 because that feels like a nice, well-rounded number to release you. But before we get to the end here, I do want to ask one last question, and that is, what overarching or major piece of advice would you give to writers like your younger self trying to begin this journey?
um, gosh, that's tough because I mean the obvious thing is, you know, just keep writing. You're going to learn to be a better writer by writing. You're not
Mm,
going to learn it in an MFA program. You're not going to learn it, you know, correspondence with some famous writer. You're going to learn
mhm,
it by writing. And I
yeah.
guess as big a cliche as that is, that's what I would say. Just, you know, don't waste your money on things that tell you they're going to make you a great writer because they're not. The only thing's going to do that is you.
I don't think that's cliche, and even if it was a little cliche, there's a reason that it's repeated. And that's a good point too, which I don't think anyone has really mentioned so far on this show, is that if they're telling you they're going to help you be better, it just comes down to you and your typewriter, you and your computer,
Yeah.
and
Now I
that's what proves the time.
I worked for a lot of years as a reporter, which is one reason I think my fantasy novels are this thick instead of this thick. Because it taught me to write very concisely and very
Yes.
get to the point, which
Mm,
I don't think is a bad thing. I think there are readers who like, you know, the big couch leveler books, and I think there are readers who like, you know, a thinner book that gets through the story faster.
mm.
And I'm perfect. I'm happy with how that taught me to write. If I wasn't, I probably wouldn't still be writing that way.
Perfect. And utilize your world experiences for your writing, and that's what it should be. We're always observing people. We're observing
Yeah.
things in our career. We're observing things at home. We're mulling ideas around. Sometimes daydreaming a little too much, and that's what being a writer is in a nutshell, right there.
And listen to how people talk around you because people say some of the strangest things sometimes. And you know, it would never occur to you to make it up, but you can sure write it down.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and I had a professor back in the day who every, I think, Wednesday would go to a local grocery store and sit in the cafe area and just write down the things that he
Yeah.
saw and the people that he listened to for a good hour every
Yeah.
week. And it pulled so many things for him because you just learn about strange human behavior and yeah, like you said, things you wouldn't have thought of that you can't make up. Things you
Right.
can't make up
Right.
in reality.
I know.
Yeah.
And in my case, I will find things that, you know, I'll hear something interesting, and then maybe years later, I'll hear something else interesting, and those two things will click up in my brain, and a story will just pop out of that. And you know, you have to stay open to that. A lot of what we do is very conscious and very, you know, down to craft, but a lot of it also comes out of, you know, the gestalt, the ether. You know, and you need to stay open.
Ether. Perfect. That's great last piece of advice. And thank you so much for coming on.
Oh,
Um,
thanks for having me. It's
yeah,
been fun.
it has been a pleasure. And how can this show is about community. So how can we become more connected with your writing community and get more of Alex Bledsoe in our life?
I am on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. I have a website cleverly called alexbledsoe.com, and I can be reached through any of those, and I'm always happy to hear from people.
Awesome. And he is very accessible and very kind. So and I can speak for that from personal experience. So we'll have that in the show notes.
Okay.
And